Rachel Martinez had been out of active duty for 3 years when she decided to visit Fort Braxton during their annual Veterans Day ceremony. The 28-year-old former Army captain had traded her combat boots for running shoes, her military fatigues for civilian clothes, and her commanding presence for a quieter life working as a trauma counselor for veterans. But some habits die hard, and respect for the military remained deeply ingrained in her DNA. The morning was crisp as Rachel walked through the main gates, wearing a simple navy blazer over dark jeans and comfortable flats. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she carried herself with the subtle confidence that never quite leaves someone who has served. She had been invited by Colonel Harrison, her former commanding officer, to speak at the ceremony about transitioning from military to civilian life. As she approached the parade grounds, Rachel noticed the organized chaos of preparation. Soldiers in dress uniforms were practicing their formations, while others polished brass and adjusted equipment. The familiar sounds of military preparation brought back a flood of memories, some wonderful, some painful, but all part of the tapestry that had shaped her into who she was today. Rachel paused near a group of newer recruits who were struggling with their formation. Their movements were stiff and uncertain, clearly still learning the intricate dance of military precision. She smiled slightly, remembering her own early days when every salute felt awkward and every command seemed to come a split second too late. "You there?" a sharp voice called out from behind her. Rachel turned to see Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson approaching with the swagger of someone who had found his small piece of authority and intended to use it. Thompson was a career military man in his early 40s, with a perfectly pressed uniform and the kind of mustache that looked like it had been measured with a ruler. His chest was decorated with various ribbons and medals, though Rachel's trained eye could tell they were mostly for service and good conduct rather than combat. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area during ceremony preparation," Thompson said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who enjoyed enforcing rules. "Civilians need to remain in the designated viewing areas." Rachel nodded respectfully. "I understand, Sergeant. I'm here as a guest speaker for the ceremony. Colonel Harrison invited me." Thompson's eyes narrowed as he looked her up and down, taking in her civilian clothes and youthful appearance. "Guest speaker, you?" He let out a small snort. "Listen, lady, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but military ceremonies are serious business. We don't need some civilian wannabe disrupting our soldiers' preparation." The words stung, but Rachel had learned long ago to choose her battles carefully. "I completely understand the importance of the ceremony, Sergeant. Perhaps you could direct me to Colonel Harrison's office." Thompson crossed his arms over his chest. "Colonel Harrison is busy with real military matters. Whatever book you're selling or whatever cause you're promoting, You can peddle it somewhere else." Rachel felt her jaw tighten slightly, but she maintained her composure. Years of military training had taught her discipline, and years of civilian life had taught her patience. "I'm not selling anything, Sergeant. I'm a veteran myself." This seemed to amuse Thompson even more. A veteran? Really? He looked at her again, his gaze lingering on her civilian clothes and subtle makeup. "What did you do? Spend a weekend at basic training before washing out?" The nearby recruits had stopped their practice to watch the exchange, their young faces uncertain about whether they should intervene or simply observe. Rachel noticed their discomfort and felt a familiar protective instinct kick in. These young soldiers didn't need to witness a confrontation between their superior and a civilian, regardless of how wrong that superior might be. "Sergeant Thompson," Rachel said quietly, "I understand you're just doing your job, but I am expected at this ceremony, and I would appreciate your help in finding Colonel Harrison." Thompson's expression grew more condescending. "You know what your problem is, lady. You watch too many movies. You think you can just show up at a military base and pretend to be something you're not." Rachel felt the familiar fire building in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced in combat zones when everything was on the line. But she was no longer in combat, and this wasn't a life-or-death situation. Still, something about Thompson's attitude reminded her of every person who had ever underestimated her, every superior who had questioned her capabilities, every moment when she had to prove herself all over again. "I'm not pretending to be anything, Sergeant," she said evenly. "Then prove it," Thompson challenged. "Show me a proper military salute. If you're really a veteran, you should know how to do it right." The request was clearly meant to embarrass her, to expose her as a fraud in front of the watching recruits. Rachel hesitated for a moment, not because she couldn't execute a perfect salute, but because she could see the trap Thompson was setting. In his mind, any salute she gave would be criticized, picked apart, and used as evidence that she didn't belong here. But sometimes, Rachel thought, you have to walk into the trap to spring it on the person who set it. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and snapped her right hand into a textbook-perfect salute. Her form was flawless, fingers straight and joined, thumb alongside her index finger, palm facing down, wrist straight. The salute was held at the precise angle, crisp and confident. Thompson studied her salute with the exaggerated attention of someone looking for flaws. After a long moment, he shook his head dismissively. "Sloppy. Your hand position is off by at least 2 degrees, and your timing is amateur. That's exactly the kind of half-hearted salute I'd expect from someone who's never actually served." The recruits shifted uncomfortably, clearly able to see that Rachel's salute had been perfect. One of them, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 19, looked particularly troubled by the sergeant's obvious unfairness. Rachel slowly lowered her hand, her expression remaining neutral despite the frustration building inside her. She had spent years perfecting that salute, had rendered it thousands of times to superior officers, foreign dignitaries, and fallen comrades. To have it dismissed so casually by someone who clearly had his own agenda was infuriating. "I see," she said quietly. "Perhaps we should just move on. I really do need to find Colonel Harrison." "Not so fast," Thompson said, clearly enjoying his moment of perceived authority. "You come onto my base claiming to be a veteran, and when I test you, you fail. Now you want to just walk away. I think the colonel needs to know about this incident." Rachel realized that Thompson had no intention of letting this go quietly. He was going to escalate the situation regardless of what she did, and his obvious prejudice was going to make any reasonable resolution impossible. She found herself at a crossroads. She could continue to try to diffuse the situation diplomatically, or she could stand her ground and deal with the consequences. "Sergeant Thompson," she said, her voice taking on a slightly different tone, not aggressive, but carrying a subtle authority that seemed to come from deep within her. "I understand you have concerns about my presence here, but I assure you that I am exactly who I say I am, and I am here at the specific invitation of Colonel Harrison." Thompson's eyes flashed with irritation. "And I'm telling you that I don't care who you think invited you. This is my area of responsibility, and I don't appreciate civilians coming here and disrespecting our traditions with their amateur hour performances." The word amateur hung in the air between them like a challenge. Rachel felt something shift inside her, a subtle change in her demeanor that the observant recruits noticed immediately. Her posture became more rigid, her gaze more focused, and suddenly the young woman in civilian clothes began to look like something else entirely. "Amateur," she repeated softly, as if tasting the word. "That's an interesting choice of words, Sergeant." Before Thompson could respond, a familiar voice called out from across the parade ground. "Rachel, there you are." Colonel Harrison approached quickly, his face breaking into a warm smile as he saw Rachel. William Harrison was a distinguished man in his 50s, with gray hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades in leadership positions. His uniform was impeccable, and his chest displayed an impressive array of ribbons and medals that spoke to a long and distinguished career. "Colonel," Rachel said, her entire demeanor brightening as she turned to greet her former commanding officer. Harrison extended his hand, which Rachel shook warmly. "I'm so glad you could make it. I've been looking forward to having you speak to our soldiers about the transition to civilian life." Thompson, who had been watching this exchange with growing confusion, stepped forward. "Colonel Harrison, sir, I was just explaining to this individual that civilians aren't allowed in the preparation area. Harrison looked between Thompson and Rachel, his expression growing puzzled. Sergeant Thompson, I'd like you to meet Captain Rachel Martinez, one of the finest officers I've ever had the privilege to serve with. The word captain hit Thompson like a physical blow. His confident expression faltered as he looked at Rachel with new eyes, suddenly seeing details he had missed before, the way she carried herself, the quiet confidence in her movements, the respectful but unwavering way she had responded to his challenges. Captain, Thompson repeated, his voice uncertain for the first time. Harrison nodded proudly. Rachel served 3 tours in Afghanistan, led countless successful missions, and saved more lives than I can count. She's one of the most decorated soldiers I've ever known. Rachel felt a familiar discomfort with praise, but she appreciated Harrison's support. Thank you, sir, but I think you're being a bit generous. Generous, Harrison laughed. Rachel, you're being too modest. Sergeant Thompson, Captain Martinez here received the Medal of Honor for her actions in Afghanistan. She's a genuine American hero. The words Medal of Honor seemed to echo across the parade ground. Thompson's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, and finally, a deep, mortifying embarrassment. The Medal of Honor was the highest military decoration, awarded for acts of valor above and beyond the call of duty. There were fewer than 70 living recipients, and Thompson had just spent the last several minutes insulting one of them. Rachel watched Thompson's face change and felt a complex mix of emotions. Part of her was satisfied to see his arrogance deflated, but another part felt almost sorry for him. She had never enjoyed humiliating others, even when they deserved it. I didn't realize, Thompson stammered, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Harrison looked at Thompson with growing concern. Sergeant, I hope you've been treating Captain Martinez with the respect she deserves. Thompson's face had gone pale. Sir, there was a misunderstanding. What kind of misunderstanding? Harrison's voice carried the tone of a commander who was beginning to suspect that something had gone wrong. Rachel stepped forward, her instinct to protect others kicking in even when it meant protecting someone who had just insulted her. Colonel, it's really not important. Sergeant Thompson was just doing his job, maintaining security during the ceremony preparation. But Harrison was not so easily deflected. He looked at the nearby recruits who were watching the exchange with wide eyes. Private Johnson, he called to one of them, what exactly happened here? The young woman Rachel had noticed earlier stepped forward nervously. Sir, the sergeant asked the captain to demonstrate a salute, and when she did, he said it was sloppy and amateur, sir. Harrison's expression darkened. He said what? Thompson looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. Sir, I can explain. You criticized the salute of a Medal of Honor recipient. Harrison's voice was deadly quiet. You called Captain Martinez an amateur. Rachel could see that the situation was spiraling beyond what she had intended. Colonel Harrison, please. This doesn't need to become a big issue. But Harrison was clearly upset. Rachel, with all due respect, this is exactly the kind of issue that needs to be addressed. Sergeant Thompson, you have spent the last several minutes insulting one of the most decorated soldiers in the American military. A woman who has sacrificed more for this country than most people could ever imagine. Thompson tried to salvage the situation. Sir, she was dressed in civilian clothes and I didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't ask. Harrison cut him off. You made assumptions based on her appearance and her civilian clothes. You saw a young woman and decided she couldn't possibly be a real veteran. The truth of Harrison's words hung in the air. Rachel realized that Thompson's behavior hadn't been about military protocol or security. It had been about his preconceived notions about who could and couldn't be a hero. Colonel, Rachel said quietly, I understand Sergeant Thompson's position. It's not uncommon for people to make assumptions. Harrison shook his head. Rachel, your humility is admirable, but it's also part of the problem. You shouldn't have to prove yourself to anyone, especially not to someone who should know better. Thompson looked like he was going to be sick. Captain Martinez, I owe you an apology. I was completely out of line. Rachel studied his face, looking for genuine remorse rather than simple fear of consequences. What she saw was a man who was genuinely shocked by his own behavior, someone who was beginning to understand the weight of his assumptions. Apology accepted, Sergeant, she said simply. But Harrison wasn't finished. Sergeant Thompson, you will report to my office after the ceremony. We need to discuss your conduct and your apparent inability to recognize a superior officer. Sir, with respect, Rachel interjected, I'm no longer active duty. Sergeant Thompson doesn't answer to me. No, Harrison agreed, but he answers to me, and I answer to the American people. And the American people deserve better than to have their heroes treated with such disrespect. The gravity of the situation was beginning to sink in for everyone present. The recruits were watching with a mixture of fascination and discomfort, while Thompson looked like he wished he could turn back time and handle the entire encounter differently. Rachel felt a responsibility to use this moment for something positive rather than simply punitive. Sergeant Thompson, may I ask you something? Thompson straightened up, though his earlier swagger was completely gone. Yes, ma'am. How long have you been training new recruits? 8 years, ma'am. And in those 8 years, how many young soldiers have you taught that respect is something that must be earned through appearance and assumptions, rather than through character and service. The question hit Thompson like a physical blow. He looked at the recruits around him, seeing their faces with new eyes. I, I never thought about it that way, ma'am. These young people look up to you, Rachel continued, her voice gentle but firm. They learn from your example about what it means to be a soldier, what it means to serve with honor. What lesson do you think they learned today? Private Johnson, the young woman who had spoken up earlier, was watching the exchange with intense interest. Rachel could see in her eyes the same fire that had driven her own military service. The desire to prove herself, to be taken seriously, to be judged by her actions rather than her appearance. "Ma'am," Thompson said quietly, "I think they learned that their sergeant made a terrible mistake and let his prejudices override his judgment." "And what are you going to do about that?" Rachel asked. Thompson was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the implications of the question. "I'm going to do better, ma'am. I'm going to make sure they understand that respect isn't about what someone looks like or how they dress. It's about their character and their service." Harrison watched this exchange with growing approval. "Sergeant Thompson, that's exactly the kind of leadership we need from our NCOs." Rachel felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond simple vindication. This was about more than just correcting one man's behavior. It was about creating a moment of learning that could ripple outward and affect how these young soldiers thought about service, respect, and judgment. "Sergeant," she said, "I'd like to ask you to do something for me." Thompson nodded eagerly. "Anything, ma'am." "I want you to help me with my speech today. I want to talk to these soldiers about the importance of looking beyond appearances, about recognizing that heroes come in all shapes and sizes and backgrounds. Will you help me make sure that message gets across?" Thompson's face showed a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Yes, ma'am. I would be honored." Colonel Harrison smiled at this exchange. "Rachel, this is exactly why I wanted you to speak today. You have a gift for turning difficult situations into teaching moments." As the group began to disperse, Private Johnson approached Rachel hesitantly. "Ma'am, could I ask you something?" "Of course." "I've been worried that people don't take me seriously because I'm young and I'm a woman. How do you deal with that?" Rachel looked at the young soldier with recognition and empathy. "You deal with it by being so good at what you do that they can't ignore you. You deal with it by maintaining your integrity even when others don't. And you deal with it by remembering that you're not just representing yourself. You're representing every person who will come after you." Johnson nodded seriously. "Thank you, ma'am, that helps." As the morning progressed, word of the incident spread through the base in the way that military gossip always does. By the time the ceremony began, Rachel had been approached by dozens of soldiers who wanted to express their appreciation for her service and their embarrassment about Thompson's behavior. But Rachel was more interested in the conversations she had with soldiers like Johnson, young people who needed to understand that their value wasn't determined by other people's assumptions, that their service mattered regardless of how they looked or where they came from. When it came time for her speech, Rachel stood at the podium looking out at an audience that included everyone from new recruits to seasoned veterans. She could see Thompson in the crowd, his face attentive and serious. "Today I want to talk to you about assumptions," she began. "About the danger of judging people by their appearance, their age, their gender, or their background. Because the truth is, heroes don't always look like what we expect them to look like." She went on to tell stories about soldiers she had served with, men and women who had shown incredible courage in moments of crisis, people who had made the ultimate sacrifice for their country and their fellow soldiers. She talked about the importance of looking beyond the surface, of recognizing that strength comes in many forms. "The most dangerous assumption you can make," she concluded, "is that you can tell someone's worth by looking at them. Because the person standing next to you might be the one who saves your life someday. And if you've already decided they're not worth your respect, you might miss the opportunity to learn from them, to serve alongside them, to become better because of them." The applause that followed was genuine and sustained. Rachel could see in the faces of the audience that her message had resonated, that the morning's incident had become something larger and more meaningful than a simple misunderstanding. After the ceremony, Thompson approached her privately. "Captain Martinez, I want you to know that what happened this morning changed something for me. I've been thinking about all the times I might have made assumptions about people, all the opportunities I might have missed to learn from someone because I decided they weren't worth my time." Rachel nodded. "We all make assumptions, Sergeant. The important thing is what we do when we realize we're wrong." "I've been talking to some of the other NCOs," Thompson continued. "We want to implement some changes in how we approach training, how we teach respect and recognition. Would you be willing to help us develop a program?" Rachel was surprised by the request. "I'm not sure I'm qualified to design military training programs." "With respect, ma'am, you're exactly the person we need. You understand what it feels like to be underestimated, and you know how to turn that experience into something positive." Over the following weeks, Rachel found herself working with the base leadership to develop new training protocols that emphasized respect, recognition, and the danger of assumptions. The program became a model that was eventually adopted by other military installations. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the relationship that developed between Rachel and the young soldiers she had met that day. Private Johnson, in particular, stayed in touch, updating Rachel on her progress and seeking advice as she advanced through the ranks. "You were right," Johnson wrote in one of her letters. "Being good at what I do has made the difference. But knowing that someone like you had faced the same challenges and overcome them made me believe I could do it too." Rachel kept that letter in her desk drawer, along with others from soldiers who had been inspired by her story. She realized that the morning's confrontation with Thompson, as unpleasant as it had created an opportunity to influence and inspire others in ways she never could have planned. The incident also led to broader conversations about recognition and respect within the military community. Rachel was invited to speak at other bases, to share her story with other soldiers who might be struggling with similar challenges. But she always remembered the lesson of that morning at Fort Braxton, that sometimes the most powerful moment of change comes not from grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but from the simple act of standing up for what's right and turning conflict into an opportunity for growth. Years later, when Rachel would tell the story to other veterans, she would always emphasize that the real victory wasn't in Thompson's embarrassment or apology. It was in the young soldiers who learned that respect is earned through character, not appearance, and that heroes come in all forms. The Medal of Honor that hung in Rachel's home office was a reminder of one moment of valor in Afghanistan. But the real honor, she came to believe, was in the ongoing work of building a military culture that recognized and valued all forms of service, regardless of how they looked or where they came from. And sometimes, she reflected, the most important battles are fought not on foreign battlefields, but in the everyday moments when we choose to stand up for what's right, to challenge assumptions, and to create opportunities for others to succeed. Thompson went on to become one of the most respected training sergeants on the base, known for his ability to see potential in soldiers that others might overlook. He never forgot the lesson of that morning, and he made sure that the soldiers he trained understood that respect is something that must be given before it can be earned. Private Johnson eventually became Sergeant Johnson, then Staff Sergeant Johnson, and finally Master Sergeant Johnson. She credited that morning's encounter with Rachel as a pivotal moment in her military career, the moment when she learned that her worth wasn't determined by other people's assumptions, but by her own actions and character. The story of what happened that morning became part of the base's unofficial history, told and retold by soldiers who wanted to remember the importance of looking beyond appearances and recognizing the heroes among them. And Rachel, whenever she returned to Fort Braxton, was always greeted with the respect and recognition that she had earned not through her Medal of Honor, but through her willingness to turn a moment of conflict into an opportunity for growth and understanding. In the end, the greatest victory wasn't in proving Thompson wrong. It was in proving that even the most difficult encounters can become opportunities for positive change, if we're willing to approach them with patience, wisdom, and the determination to make things better for those who come after us.